Welcome and thank you for joining us on the second episode of Dear Dead People.
This podcast is about the many failures of history and how those failures affect the people of today. Directed, produced, and written by Gen Z across the world.
My name is Yvonne Liu.
And I'm Emily Lohman, and today we will be discussing the development of legal codes in ancient Babylon, specifically Hammurabi's legal code, and their connection to ancient social hierarchies, as well as how those social hierarchies manifest themselves in our criminal justice system today.
Here to provide some important insight on the matter are representatives from The Forerunner, a youth-led magazine whose last issue centered around Black Lives Matter and Black influence in pop culture.
Make sure to check them out on their last issue and follow them on Instagram.
Without further ado, let's dive into this important topic. Talking about Hammurabi's code and the birth of the justice system. Today we have two guest speakers, Jalea from The Forerunner and Sharia also from The Forerunner, and they're going to tell us a little bit about their youth magazine.
Hi, my name is Jalea. I recently started The Forerunner magazine in collaboration with Salma El-Deeb. I'm a senior in high school and Salma is a junior, and The Forerunner is essentially dedicated to spreading information with ease and providing a voice for minorities who don't usually get the opportunity to speak. We have a lot of writing opportunities and art that we feature on our website and within our issues. It's very exciting, and I'm glad to be here today.
Following up on that, hi, my name is Saria. I am the Deputy Article Director at The Forerunner, so I help run the writing team. And just jumping on to what Jalea said, we're really all about producing good content, allowing people to have the opportunity to get their stuff published, and yeah, that's about it.
And your last issue was on Black influence in pulp culture, right?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, we really wanted to focus on a topic that was relevant to everything going on, especially with the passing of George Floyd. We felt that we needed to provide a voice for Black Gen Z youth, especially, and their feelings on the situation. And we wanted to create this issue with the idea of showing how Black people have been essential to pop culture and how they continue to be essential. And we were very excited with the release of the first issue. Saria can talk about the writing if she'd like, but it was very nice to put together, and I was really excited to do so.
Yeah, I was blown away for our first issue with the work that was created by the writing team. I loved how they went into depth about topics that people maybe didn't really think about. There was a piece about the Black influence on like the punk scene that I really, really enjoyed, and especially how the writing team worked together with the art team to create the graphics. That part particular is just my favorite. Or how me and Salma worked together and we interviewed like Black MUAs about their influence in the beauty community. And overall, I think I'm especially just proud of how they took the topics they were passionate about and sort of turned them on their heads and tried to have people reconsider things in a new light or to think about representation in a way that they didn't before. So.
Yeah, it's really great. I took a look at your issue, really inspiring. The art is on point.
It's
very, very great graphics. All right, so we're going to get started. This episode is about Hammurabi. Hammurabi was the sixth king of the Babylonian Empire, which is in
Mesopotamia.
Right.
So now southern Mesopotamia is in modern-day Iraq, and most of the cities that were in Mesopotamia contained temples and worshipped their god Marduk.
And then with the growth of these cities in the Mesopotamia region, there were interactions between people that became more prevalent. Basically, we're getting the first modern civilization. We're getting urbanization, real trade and communication. And then with that, we get disagreements and disputes in this first society. Hammurabi created a code that contained 282 laws covering topics of family, malpractice, property, trade, irrigation, and injuries.
So one of Hammurabi's laws, the first law actually says that if a man brings an accusation against another man, charging him with murder, but he cannot prove it, the accuser shall be put to death. So this was the first precedents that set the presumption of innocence. So people will be innocent until proven guilty, and the accuser needs to bring proof to the trial. So the burden of proof is given to whoever makes the accusation. So in the justice system today, that would be the prosecutor. And the prosecutor has to provide the evidence that incriminates the defendant. And then the defendant is required to prove his innocence, and now the defendant has the burden of proof.
And then with what everything going on with Black Lives Matter, we certainly see a disparity of people who are able to get the proper needs for defense when they're in marginalized communities.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So getting a proper attorney, or getting the basis for the evidence, or even just having people cooperate with you is a real struggle for people of color, and it is definitely one of the most prevalent issues in the justice system of today. The second law in Hammurabi's code says that if a man has accused another of laying a spell upon him but has not proved it, the accused shall go to the sacred river, he shall plunge into it, and if the sacred river shall conquer him, the accused shall take he that accused him shall take possession of his house. And if the sacred river shows his innocence and he is saved, the accuser shall be put to death.
And this was basically punishment dealt by religion.
Right.
Right. If the accused basically did not survive, that meant they were guilty and they were just dead, and that's just how they rolled with it.
So like in Salem, right?
Yeah, like in Salem.
Where, well, if she lives, she was a witch. If she died, that was a bummer.
Yeah, basically, that was really, and everybody like recognizes how messed up the Salem witch trials were.
Yeah.
So for there to be an actual code of law made that was basically the Salem witch trials, that's a little rough.
And then another law that we really wanted to focus on was the infamous an eye for an eye. So if the punishment is proportional to the crime, sort of like a bone for a bone, tooth for a tooth kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So do you agree with eye for an eye law? Do you think that any guy or any man who kills should be put to death himself? Like, what's your thoughts? Especially in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement.
I disagree strongly. I think the phrase an eye for an eye, we most commonly see it used to justify, for example, the death penalty. Now, the death penalty is like this really controversial topic, but they do studies and they prove, like, I can go check this later, but around 4% of people who receive the death penalty are innocent. So I think when you do this whole eye for an eye logic, it really falls on the responsibility of the accuser, whether that's in the U.S. legal system or even what the system they're talking about in Hammurabi's code. It falls upon the responsibility of the accuser to prove that they're in the right. So I think an eye for an eye is just a very dangerous mentality. And I strongly disagree with it in terms of even to how it's being used today to justify things like the death penalty, for sure.
Yeah, that quote makes me think of, I can't remember who said it, but what is it? An eye for an eye makes the whole world go blind, or something like that. I think that quote, I've actually done an assignment on this before. I think that quote reflects how I feel about that issue. If everyone were to go by that rule, there would be no forgiveness. There's no room for improvement, I think, which is reflected within our criminal justice system today. There's not a lot of, you go to prison and you're more likely to go back. There's no set reform. I think that shows in Hammurabi's code. And there's another quote that I'd rather all the guilty men go free than one innocent man be locked in prison. And I also like that quote a lot when considering the death penalty and life in prison, both.
I think when we're in the mentality of an eye for an eye, like you said, it's just very dangerous, especially when a lot of people don't have the same access to a proper defense, and especially with people of color, there's a huge disparity of the amount of people put on death sentence that are white versus POC, you know.
Yeah.
And that really shows the marginalizations of these communities because of their inability to provide proper defense.
Right. I agree. I definitely think that, especially as of right now, considering how many people have been resentenced as innocent, I guess, after they've already been put on the death penalty, like, that's just extremely dangerous. Like, you could run the risk of killing someone for nothing. And I think that in the justice system today, where so many of people on death row have been proven innocent, it's just not right to keep it active, you know?
And then there's always, with DNA testing and everything, there's been a lot of cases where these people who have been put on trial and sentenced to the death sentence, and that sentence has been carried out, it should have been revoked because we didn't have all this advancements in technology as we do now. And we're actually innocent because of the DNA.
Right. So, and in the time of Hammurabi and Babylon, instead, like, if you killed someone, it depended on who it was that you killed to determine whether or not you would receive the death penalty. So, for some crimes, instead of having the same act done to the criminal, they'd be fined what was deemed fit in silver shekels. And so that normally happened when the crime was committed against someone who they deemed property, which would have been their slaves or the women in the household. So it was really only when you killed a man, a free man, that the criminal himself was killed, which just outlines the entire social hierarchy and how they labeled humanity. One of the laws, Law 199, says that if he destroys the eye of a man's slave or breaks a bone of a man's slave, he shall pay 1/2 his price. So slaves weren't even seen as people. They were treated as objects, and they were, if someone broke or hurt a slave, it was treated as if it was a toy, and you would have to, like, pay someone back for breaking their toy. So it just was really awful, honestly.
And it's crazy that this is the first justice system that we ever see in, like, modern civilizations. This is the first one that we ever see, and we're already seeing this disparity in social classes and punishments dealt by social class. So it's no wonder that right now we're seeing so much of that being translated today in our justice system.
Yeah, for sure. You could make a comparison even between when you're talking about, how they did payouts, and I think you said silver shekels. You can compare that today. So, for example, Breonna Taylor's family received $12 million, I think, for the settlement. But the charges that were levied against not even 3 of the officers, but 1 out of the 3 wasn't for her death at all. It was for, like, to my understanding, I think I might be wrong, but it was like damage to the property surrounding Breonna Taylor's house. So it was like wanton endangerment to the people that weren't her. So it goes to show that depending on where you stand on, like, this hierarchical ladder that existed then and existed today is still directly correlated to, like, the price that you would pay for the crime.
Right. Yeah. I saw a sign at a protest that said the officers that killed Breonna Taylor weren't charged for her death. They were charged for the bullets that missed. And that kind of, like, really speaks to how law enforcement is in our country. They don't care that someone is dead. It's just around it.
I see a lot of this quote, especially in today's society. Like, I guess not even generally the criminal justice system. Of course, yes, the criminal justice system, but like the way media covers the criminal justice system, you hear cases of kidnappings for white privileged children or celebrities' children. You hear about those type of cases that make national news, but the several black women that go missing, the several trans women that go missing or have violence committed against them don't make national news. They aren't in the public eye. They aren't considered as high in the public eye because people think their identity or their just general being is invalid. And I think that reflects the quote, this quote especially, treating people as if they aren't human to justify your actions. We've seen that literally all throughout history. And I think it still applies today.
Right. So, Hammurabi's code was not the first code of law. It was influenced by some that came before it, specifically the, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Urukagina.
You're correct, Pegina, yeah.
Urukagina?
Yeah.
The Urukagina code made in 2400 BC that was aimed at creating an equal society. So priests were limited in power, which right now the social hierarchy stemmed from temples. Temples were the largest, most powerful. The priests held all the power. It was basically like the first kings were the priests of the civilization. So priests were limited in power, and orphans and widows were free from taxes. Urukagina code may have influenced the degradation of women in that was present in Hammurabi's code. If in the Urukagina code, if a woman committed polyandry, she would be stoned to death, and if she spoke badly of a man, her mouth would be crushed with burnt bricks, and men would not suffer the same punishments if they were caught doing any of the things that women were.
No, that's wild. That's crazy. Can you imagine being stoned to death for like because you were committing polyandry, or like if imagine in class if like there was a guy next to you and he was like mouthing off and you told him to shut up, your mouth would be filled with burning bricks. It would be so bad.
I say this all the time, but
polyandry.
I think that's
having more than one partner.
So just
polyamory. Okay, I see what it is.
So like, I say this a lot, but if I was born before now, I would have been killed so many times. So many times. It's not.
Yeah, me too.
I would never have survived. Oh my gosh. So Hammurabi's code objectified women in pretty much the same way. So if the wife of a man is caught lying with another man, they shall bind them and throw them into the water. And if the husband of the woman wishes to spare his wife, the king shall spare his servant. That was Law 129. Either both of them survive or neither of them survive, and the man could choose whether or not
to save the woman.
Yes.
So basically, during this time, a woman's sexuality was the ownership of her husband, and that's just terrible.
Yeah. To be put to death. I mean,
yeah, that reminds me of the debate over like marital rape, whether you agree to consent no matter what to your husband or your partner. It just, that immediately made me think of that.
Yeah. Right. Especially with the rise of the Me Too movement, there's been a lot of heat about rape allegations and everything over the last couple of years, and we've kind of seen, because now there's so many, I don't want to say it. There are a lot of people that take issues with feminism and saying that when women come forward, they're just asking for attention and all that. And it really reminds me when we're looking back at these codes that it's so deeply rooted into our system that women are just second rate to men.
It also plays into this idea of like following what Julia was saying about marital rape, how the question of like consent, people would always frame it in terms of like the woman and whether or not, oh, she did this, she said that, she wore this, she was in a relationship with him, she was married to him, and it takes all the responsibility off like whoever the perpetrator is. And you sort of see that in these codes and how that's like still, like you were saying, like in our system to this day, that like everything is all on her, and not even that she was like with this other man in the first place.
Right. Another major thing that like Law 142 and 143 really just like completely highlight, and it shows exactly the difference between men and women. So Law 142 says, if she has been discreet and has no vice, which means if she has been modest and has not committed adultery, and her husband has gone out and belittled her and shamed her, the woman has no blame, and she shall take her marriage portion and go up to her father's house. So basically giving her the ability to divorce and basically separate. But if in Law 143, if she has not been discreet and has gone out and ruined her house, belittled her husband, she shall be drowned immediately. Nothing else. Just killed right there. And that's just like, for a woman to be divorced from her husband was the lowest you could get. She's never going to be able to get remarried. She's never going to be able to get a job or provide for her children. She's been divorced and separated, and all she has is whatever was left of her marriage portion, and she is now dependent on her father. And that's a horrible place for the woman to be in, especially back then. But for the man, for her to have been out and about and talks badly of her husband, she's just killed immediately. It's a lose-lose situation. So the social classes that existed in Babylon were the Amalu, the elite, the Mushkanu. My bad. This is totally my fault. The middle class, and the Ardu, the slaves.
And in Hammurabi's code, if a crime was committed against a lower class citizen, the punishment would not be as harsh. So say if you killed a slave, you might have to pay like the owner of the slave half whatever the slave was worth, which is awful.
And it also depends on who committed the crime.
Right.
Because if a slave kills another slave, then the slave will be put to death. But if a man kills a slave, then he has to pay 2 coins. Law 282 says that if a slave has said to his master, "You are not my master," he shall be brought to account as his slave, and his master shall cut off his ear. So slaves weren't given individual rights. They were basically told, they were slaves. They weren't paid. They were treated harshly. They had no rights. They weren't treated as people. Mm-hmm. It was just like any other system of slavery out there. And it's just that the code of law basically said you cannot even try to have rights or to speak up or to do anything. You have to stay in your position.
Do we know if the Babylonian system of slavery was centered around, was it race-based, or was it just the situation you were born into?
I'm pretty sure we don't know exactly what it was. However, I will say in biblical accounts of the slaves in Egypt, it was definitely race-based. Okay. It was based off of who was in a tribe and which tribes came in. It was, even though it wouldn't be like modern day race-based, based off of the color of your skin, mm-hmm. but it was based off of your allegiance to whichever tribe.
Yeah, like your ethnicity.
Okay, yeah.
Or like how the Jewish people were slaves in Egypt, stuff like that. But definitely when I hear like the phrase, if a slave says to his master, "You are not my master," and then they cut off his ear, it definitely points to like that it's literally written into the legal system that there's no social mobility, and it's so limited to be able to move from like one stage of the hierarchy to the one right above it. And we still see a lot of that today, even though it's not as explicit. We have this whole idea of like the American dream that anyone can work hard and they can make it, which to some extent is true, but a lot of times the people who make it are sort of exceptions to the rule. And that if you look at most of the people who have most of the money, they started off with a lot of money. It's so incredibly difficult to go from like 0 to 100. Yeah. That makes sense.
What you said actually brings up a thought that I've had for a while. It's like when you look at average America, it's a bell curve, right? As any average is. When people talk about, oh, anyone can make it, they're talking about one person out of a couple 100 million who made it because they were lucky or because they somehow got an opportunity that wasn't available to everyone else. So it's not anyone can make it, because if anyone could make it, it would be the average. The average person right in the middle was able to move, but it wasn't. It was this one person. You're talking about a 1 in a million chance. And it's like, that's not statistically correct. You can't just say, oh, anyone can do it, because you can't.
Yeah, that really brings to attention. I saw this quote, I can't even remember, but it was basically equality versus when you adjust
Equity?
Equality versus equity is when you adjust based on the needs of a disadvantaged group. So basically, when we look at how the United States has set up after the end of slavery, Black people and people of color were always put in marginalized communities, and you cannot move up from that. There is no social mobility, as you said. And then when you're in that spot, even if you have equality, if you have equal rights, there's not a guarantee you'll be able to move up because you are so disadvantaged from white people.
Yeah. Social hierarchy has started developing in other places after the foundation of Babylon. So Europe had feudalism, and so it was basically administrative control over the distribution of land. So lords would offer vassals land and protection in exchange for their labor working the farms. And fiefs were hereditary, so the family in power always stayed in power. And I feel like that's generally what we have today. It may not be so formal, and it may not be like, oh, you're separated into classes, because we don't say it or delineate it like that. But it's still, you've got a ruling class, and they will say, oh, I'll protect you so long as you do this. For instance, in unions, in workers' unions, they'll be like, some employers do not allow their workers to have a union. And so they'll be like, oh, I'll treat you well and I'll pay you so long as you don't start a workers' union.
Right.
And if you do start a workers' union, then you'll be fired and blacklisted. And so it's kind of like,
You see, even not countries, my apologies. Companies like Amazon, they even hire like analysts, and they hire people whose position, their sole job is solely to ensure that unions aren't formed. And because they pose such a danger to companies, because that's how the majority of workers' rights were achieved. You can look back to, I was about to say the Civil War. That is not true. The Industrial Revolution, where workers were being mistreated, and then they had to they striked, and that's how they fought for their labor rights. The things like minimum wage, how many hours can a child work. That's why unions are so dangerous, because they hold real bargaining power. So that's why what you see in corporations today, like Amazon, they have people whose sole job is just to make sure that unions don't form, like analysts who they'll track certain lines, certain emails, certain modes of communication.
Yeah, what we were saying earlier about the social hierarchy and not being able to move, through that, I think I'm going to use Amazon as an example again. Jeff Bezos, a lot of people like to go to Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates or Elon Musk as sources of how you could succeed when you're not given the upper hand. But if you look further into how they got to that situation, those were men of privilege. So Elon Musk has deep, deep family money from South Africa. And Jeff Bezos, to start off his company, was given, I believe it was 300,000 from his parents. So they were born into situations that allowed them to succeed. But when you compare it to the average American, especially the average minority, that is not given to them. There is no opportunity like that. There is no hundreds of thousands of dollars for them to start a business or develop from that. It's much harder.
Right. And then going back on the idea of family, always empower. We're all in high school, right? Everyone here is in high school. So we're applying to colleges, and and everything. So if your family member was a successful alumni, you have a greater percentage of getting in
Right.
to a college, which I hate.
Yeah.
For sure.
As a first generation college student, I hate
disagree.
that.
Another form of social hierarchy is the government we have in America. So we have an elitist rule. This is just never stated by anyone in power. It's not that it's not true because you've never heard it before. It's just because nobody wants to say it.
Right.
So wealthy corporations have extreme influence over the U.S. government, and you see this with donations
to campaigns,
the
lobbyist groups,
mm-hmm.
just everything in general in America, in American government has the potential to be influenced by any amount of money.
Right. So right now, what happened yesterday, I believe, is Trump's tax avoidance came out. And I think it's so funny.
Oh, I read that whole report. I saw that, and I was like, and then I showed it to Trump supporting Dan. He was off the bat. He was like, "Not true. It's an anonymous source, so it can't be true." And I'm like, "But, okay."
See, I think it's so funny how Trump sent all these tax breaks to large corporations and gave all that COVID relief to large corporations when they didn't need it, and is doing all this and this and this because it will benefit him and the people who give him money to not have to pay taxes.
Yeah. On a sidetrack note, I think a lot of people, I've heard so many different reasons why people think either the report isn't true. They'll say, oh, it's fake news, it's an anonymous source. That's the reason that's not true is because when you're working as a journalist, there's this thing called like the journalistic code of ethics. Anonymous sources are only used when what this government employee or this Trump administration person to disclose, that was illegal. It's illegal for them to disclose that, but they put themselves at risk because it's information the American public should know. And that's when anonymous sources are used. And not only that, the New York Times could be sued for libel or slander, which is why they don't publish things like this if they weren't true, because that would be an incredible risk to like their business. Because are they a newspaper? Yeah, but they're still a business. They're still a corporation, unlike anything, just like everything else. But that's just a side note about the tax returns.
Yeah, very, very good point. So
yeah, just general tax avoidance. Whenever people, especially of a higher class, talk about how, oh, they're taxed so much, or doctors are taxed unfairly, they're taxed too much, they went to med school, or they got a higher education for a reason. It's shocking to hear for me, coming from a single parent family, knowing that my mom pays the same percentage of taxes as a doctor, and she was not obviously given the opportunity to go to med school. That's not what she pursued. But just because of that, she has to pay the same amount as somebody who is complaining about their amount of taxes that they have to pay when they make so much.
For sure.
Yeah.
Literally working as a lifeguard over the summer, you have more, like I worked over the summer, I did it for a good chunk of the school year. I had more taken out of my paycheck each month because they take it out for like social security and stuff than he has paid in total federal income tax.
We see a lot of applications for the flat tax, which is basically your tax rate based on the amount of income for every single person. And I believe that's also liable to corporations. So if your corporation makes a certain amount, it's taxed in according to how much you make, right?
Oh yeah, isn't that the capital gains tax?
Yeah, capital gains tax.
Yeah. I mean, again, talking about billionaires and people in positions of power, a lot of people like to say, oh, Bill Gates donates money, or he has a foundation, or Amazon donates money. They don't consider how much of that money, like, Amazon has a lot more money that it could donate, and they're simply donating the minimum amount to get a tax break.
Right.
Yeah.
And what's also is, whenever you look at those donations and everything, you have to think, okay, well, did they donate that because they thought it was a good cause? Or did they donate that so that they could just say their income was less?
Yeah, exactly.
Statistics about Jeff Bezos, I can look them up, but those statistics are terrifying. I think there's statistics that he could like end world hunger, and not that which is a difficult thing to conceptualize, because obviously it's impossible to truly end world hunger, but he could really alleviate world hunger and still have like a good chunk of his fortune left.
Yeah.
But I think there comes a point when you're sitting on that much money, inaction is inherently like the action that you're putting forth by failing to do things that you're continuing to allow, like things like world hunger. Obviously there's a million issues in the world, but allowing those kind of issues to like continue to be perpetrated.
Yeah, the value of $1 to like me compared to Jeff Bezos, very different, very different. I think that's why he probably has no concept of how regular American people live their daily lives, especially surrounding income and money.
So, one thing that should be brought up though is that Amazon uses their, I wouldn't say uses, they have I guess, a byproduct of their tax avoidance by having no sales tax. And so consumers can pay less for the items they get from Amazon. What are your thoughts?
I've discussed this in my economics class, and everybody just looks at me like I'm a little bit crazy. But I think the intention behind like donating or giving a consumer, I guess, a quote unquote benefit is really important when you're given it. Like, just because you donate to a charity, you may be donating the minimum amount. The reason behind you donating especially counts. I do think that it should be considered. And having no sales tax, okay, that's great for the consumer maybe in that moment, but you may not consider the people who are making those products for Amazon that are in those workhouses that are not being treated with good conditions under any circumstance.
Right. We actually talked about that in our last episode with globalization and outsourcing factories and everything to other countries where the labor laws aren't as strict.
Yeah.
And especially with companies like Amazon, people don't really consider where these products are coming from and how they're being made. So that's just very important to look at.
Right.
Yeah, I think
obviously like a lot of people say there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, which is true. It's impossible to be 100% perfect. The podcast is being recorded on a phone that was mass produced in some factory somewhere where the workers probably aren't being treated the best. There's no way to be perfect. You know, people be using Amazon because they're immunocompromised. They can't go to the store, especially right now, and get everything they need. It's easier for them to order it online. That being said, it isn't an excuse on the behalf of the corporation to act the way they do. When you look at Amazon's treatment of workers, even here in the United States, sure, they get paid $15 an hour, but they have an incredibly high turnover rate of employees because they're notorious for not giving bathroom breaks, for forcing pregnant women to work like exorbitant hours, especially on their feet. I just remember watching this John Oliver special where it's just so much taxing physical labor, and if that's the labor that needs to be done for the job, that's one thing, but they aren't compensating that with appropriate breaks, with appropriate like the accommodations that they would need.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's interesting that with Hammurabi's code, they're obviously not having the large capitalistic society that we have today, but they still have the basic fundamental principles of like human rights and who's deemed worthy and the punishment for a different crime. It still fits even today, and especially when considering large corporations. I think that when we look at where things come from, it's very difficult for the average consumer, especially under laissez-faire capitalism, to have any sort of influence because of the large accumulation of wealth within these corporations, that basically control most of America and the products that you get. A lot of people rely on Amazon. They can't make that decision to not buy from Amazon because they think it's not ethical. It's something that they rely on, and it's an unfortunate byproduct of the system that we have.
Hypothetical section of the game of the podcast. So since we have guest speakers, we're trying to play like a little game. So basically, we're just gonna ask, if you were in charge of the justice system back then, if you were in Hammurabi's shoes, how would you do it? So we're gonna start with Jalea, and then we're gonna go to Shuri.
Okay. Essentially, I think both Hammurabi and today could learn from this, having a justice system that's based on reform. So having, of course, punishment and a, a form of punishment that fits the crime, of course, but not an eye for an eye type system where you make a mistake and you're immediately killed for that action. I personally think that the justice system should serve to improve the life of a criminal so that they can become a regular citizen. They would like learn the responsibilities of civic duty. I think that reform is possible, and I especially believe that with education and proper tools and, of course, proper treatment and proper wages for criminals, that we could have a way better system of justice that reforms a criminal so that they don't go back in the system. There isn't that cycle that repeats and repeats where you go in prison and then you go back. I especially draw on my personal situation with my father. He's been in and out of jail since he turned 18, and it has not stopped. And unfortunately, he was born into circumstances that didn't permit him to rise above. But if the justice system had taught him, even like with his first arrest at 18, I believe that a better future could have been possible.
That's a very good answer. Okay, and then we're gonna go to Sharia.
If I were to create the justice system right now, a justice system would be focused on just that, justice. So that would be twofold, and obviously justice for victims, but justice for perpetrators in terms of giving them the chance for rehabilitation. Can everyone be rehabilitated? No, and that's just like the sad fact of life. But I do think, let's say if we took Hammurabi's quote, if they had an equivalent in that civilization of like low level drug offenses, why should they be put in prison for that, just to leave prison and then use drugs again and to continue to perpetuate like that cycle? I think that they should go to like drug rehab, the equivalent of drug rehab in that society. I'm sort of saying both then and now. Or for instance, I don't think that the death penalty should exist. In my opinion, I don't think we have the right to condemn anyone to death, because there is always a chance that we are wrong. And even if they are like the most heinous criminal to ever exist, that they were proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that they were guilty, I just don't think it's within our right as human beings to kill another human being.
Mm-hmm.
And that also plays into my idea just that I agree with innocent until proven guilty, but I think the means about proving guilty have to change. I think juries, I still believe in the existence of juries, but I think that they should more accurately reflect like the society as a whole. I just watched this piece the other day about how lawyers are allowed to like strike out a certain amount of juries, and more often than not, they strike people of color before they even have the chance to sit in a jury. And they've done studies that show that more diverse juries, like diversity in terms of color or in terms of whatever, leads to this diversity of thought that comes to a better conclusion.
Right.
More diverse juries they were more willing to have uncomfortable conversations. They were more willing to consider every side of the situation. The fact of the matter is that all white juries are damaging in the criminal justice system. So overall, those would be like my three main things: rehabilitation, abolition of the death penalty, and more diverse juries in my ideal criminal justice system.
Awesome answer. All right, Emily, what would you do?
So I would focus on equity, I think, because I think back then it would have been similar to now, where there would have been quite a bit of racism against certain ethnicities, and there would have been a lot of sexism against women. So I think my law would focus on equity, where it would prevent discrimination and ensure complete access and equal access to everything. And I think I would promote opportunities in disadvantaged communities so that it wouldn't just be equality, but equity,
Yeah.
Like my sort of thing is equity until it's no longer needed when people are equal,
That sounds good. Oh, it's my turn then.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'm really big on education, and we're kind of connecting this like with the first Justice Code and our system. When you look at our national budget, there is a stupid amount dedicated to the military. It's so stupid. Mm-hmm. There's a huge amount dedicated to the military, and if you took like the tiniest fraction of that and put it over to rehabilitation and education, I think a lot of crime rate would go down and just things would generally be better for everyone. If I had to go back and do the justice system, first off, before doing that, I would establish like trade centers kind of in a way where you are taught skills, like free trade school, basically. Right. You are taught like skills you can use in daily life to like get jobs and everything. So that could be working on the computer, or if you like physical building things or fixing things. And then if you were charged with a crime that has to do with like your circumstances and the way you've been disadvantaged. Mm-hmm. So if you're stealing for food, or or even if you're like using drugs or anything, you should be immediately put into education reform. Because honestly, I think if everyone was forced to go to school every day, they would eventually learn something, and then they could use that to apply to their life and learn to be a little bit better.
Right.
You know?
So long as it's education while they're also being taken care of.
Right.
Right.
That's important too.
Yeah, because like you can't. I know a lot of people who have dropped out of school because they need to work to support their families and take care of their parents. So, education, so long as they're being supported while they educate themselves. Kind of going along with Reformation is the issue that we have with social stratification. So, prisons, hospitals, pharmacies, and schools all have one thing in common. They're businesses. They have been transformed to exist to make and thrive off of money. So according to Campbellsville University, the U.S. Department of Justice is still dependent on prison contractors. So the American prison system generates over $774 billion per year.
That is a lot.
Mm-hmm. And the two biggest privately owned prison corporations, the Corrections Corporation of America and GEO Group, generated $2.5 billion in 2012 alone. So they're basically just making money off of having people incarcerated. Which
are these private prisons? Or I know there's a difference. I know there's like for-profit prisons as opposed to public prisons. So is that what this statistic is referring to?
Yes. These are private.
Okay. All right, that makes more sense. So they have a motivation to like lobby the government to create legislation that would keep people incarcerated for longer, or keep people incarcerated easier because they would make more money.
Exactly. Right. So the number of incarcerated individuals in the U.S. has increased by over 500% in the past 40 years because of new policies that increase the number of people serving longer sentences for minor offenses.
And that typically involves marginalized communities.
Like drug offenses, or stealing because you have nothing to eat, or just low-level possession
of contraband.
Anything. Yeah. I saw a post that was of two people with the exact same crime. I believe it was reckless driving. One was a white man, one was a black man. It was exactly the same. Everything, the case details, the crime, everything. The white man, I think, had 5 years of prison and a month of probation, and the black man had 15 years of prison and then 6 years of probation.
Jesus, that's awful.
Everything was except for the
same cases where, like, I read this case of this woman who she filed her address incorrectly on purpose in order to get her kid, for context, she was African American, in order to get her kid into a better schooling district. And I believe, I don't want to be wrong on this, but I think she got like 5 years in prison or something like that for misreporting her address. And then you see like people commit crimes of such like higher severity. So like I'm trying to think of one that comes to mind right now. Take Brock Turner, for instance. It was this whole big thing many years ago that he had committed sexual assault, and he got 6 months in prison. He was let off early on good behavior. So it just goes to show how like it's not even about severity of the crime when the justice system from your arrest to your incarceration is like could put you at a disadvantage.
Right.
Yeah.
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 I was going to bring up that example of the mother who claimed a different address because I think it's really interesting, and it especially shows just how our prison system has been messed up, especially the sentencing. With Lori, I don't want to mess up her name, Lori Loughran or Loughran. I know the woman from
College lady, right?
yeah,
Oh
she
my.
paid her way into her child's college, and she only received, I believe it was 2 to 3 months,
Mm-hmm.
when someone for a lesser crime, like a person of color, receives a way higher sentence. It's astonishing.
Right. I would that when that woman filed for a different address to have her kid in a better school system, it was because she was part of a poor community.
Mm-hmm.
And it really just goes to show again that it is because people in those communities are judged to be almost like just second class people that these punishments have been carried out to them.
Yeah. So prisons, private prisons, and I'm sure federal prisons as well, will cut funds from cleaning services to save money. So the prison system, the U.S. prison system, basically strips you of your humanity. You have a number assigned to you. You're no longer a free person, you're a dollar sign. So they look at you as another $6,000 or as another $14,000 rather than a person who needs rehabilitation to become a functioning member of society. They don't want that. They don't want you to rehabilitate because then you won't come back. Then you won't give them more money. So it just, it's horrible. And they don't affect everyone equally. They stack the decks against minorities because they are easy to target. And it's like, how can you, I don't understand it. I know that people get consumed by greed and that people care about money more than anything, but how can you do that to people on purpose? Like, it's not like they don't know what they're doing. They know. And they just strip people of their humanity for money. I die.
Yeah, what you're talking about, like a person who's incarcerating becoming a dollar sign, that reminds me of the Hammurabi code that we talked about. I don't remember what law it was specifically, but the one saying that if you damage a slave or kill a slave, you have to pay back half of their worth. You're doing the same thing today when you value somebody's life when they're incarcerated purely because of their labor or what they can do for you. I don't understand how someone can strip people, especially an entire group of people, of their humanity and see them as a dollar sign just because you want a profit. It doesn't make sense.
73.1% of the wealth in the U.S. is concentrated amongst the top 10% of the population. And the gap keeps growing, and it has grown significantly over the past 3 decades with the rise of people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and such. And so it makes it increasingly difficult for low-income families to gain ground. And most low-income families are African American, Hispanic, disabled, or veterans. I think one of the things that people don't really think about is that we have, what was it? I forget the exact number, but the wealth disparity in our country right now is
It's just really
way,
high.
way worse than it was during the French Revolution. Those people couldn't eat, they couldn't live because the aristocracy was taking all their money. And they revolted because it was horrible. And I think it's easy for us, because I'm middle class, it's easy for people in the middle class to overlook it and to say, oh, there's nobody starving in this country.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we're a first world country. And so we just ignore all the people who are starving and who are homeless and who have to choose between eating or being able to get to work.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people don't feel like you can go to the gas station and buy a cheap meal, or you can pay for gas to get to work. And so people don't see that as them like starving because they could buy food. But the fact of the matter is they're not. They're not eating. They have to go to work.
Right.
And so they are starving, but that's how the majority of the lower class is. They have to choose all the time, and that's horrible.
Yeah. The fact you said about the French Revolution, that just reminds me, because we're talking about the wealth disparity and issues and specifically targeting minorities in the criminal justice system, in the wealth disparity, like we're dealing with that. It's coming to light. It's being a little more prevalent in media, I think. And with that has come the Black Lives Matter movement, similar protests and everything. But I see a reflection of the civil rights movement and the ending of apartheid in South Africa. Essentially, what I mean is they were demonized in their time for being radicals or destructing property or just disobeying the law, when in reality, they were fighting for their rights. They wanted to change, and they went about it how they thought would best improve their lives. And you can't really judge them for that, but we're doing it right now.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. I would definitely view this as like, I've thought this a lot over maybe like the past 2 years, but I think what's happening right now is quite literally a moment of history. And when you're in history class, it's so easy for you to be like, oh, I know I would fight back. I know that I would speak up. And then it's actually happening, and you see a lot of people dismiss it right out of hand. When you protest by taking a knee, that's not the right way to protest because that's disrespectful to flag. When you protest by, I know here in Miami, they like walked off a highway or something like that. That's not the right way to protest because it's like, how do you say, it's obstructing the road. Or there's just like how they said back then that when they would stage sit-ins or when they would do marches, that wasn't the right way to protest, and they were met with violence. Although there's certainly been like significant gains over the past 50 or 60 years for civil rights, that attitude of, oh, it's fine if you protest, just do it right, is still there. But they say that, and then there's no right, quote unquote, right way to go about it, because their issue isn't with your method. They could say it is, but their issue is really with like your content and what you're saying.
Right.
I really like what Jalea was saying earlier about apartheid, because I know when I was learning about that, so many people were shocked that actually happened. Like, no one knew that before they got to world history class. And I think it's a large part of it's largely at fault the education system in teaching people what's important in history. And that's kind of why we're making this podcast, to talk about these issues and the fact that they're historically prevalent, that we're seeing trends. Actually, it's not just something that's been popping up in the news and you're like, oh, hey, that just happened. No, this has been rooted in our history since the beginning of humanity.
Yeah, what Saria said with protests and especially sitting down during the pledge, I just was recently informed that it is Florida law that you are required to at least stand in school for the pledge. I was told that by a teacher, so was my friend. So I found that very interesting, and I'm considering civil disobedience. That's all.
Julia's like, this fight will start with me right now. I wouldn't know. My school, maybe that's just my school, but I haven't stood in like a year or like a year and a half or so, and it just hasn't been a big deal. But I guess it depends on if your teacher's willing to like pick a fight on it.
Yeah. So education, that's a huge issue as well. People use education as their social mobility. The more education you have, the higher you get paid, the easier it is to move up in the social hierarchy. But Children from low-income families have a higher rate of absenteeism, or they leave school altogether, likely because, once again, they have to work to support their family, or they have to take care of a sick family member, and there's no one to do it. They can't just send them to a hospital or a care center or anything. They have to do it themselves. And those who do attend school from low-income families have 7 times greater rates of dropout than those of higher income families.
Mm-hmm.
That's not coincidental.
Yeah.
That's not just, a random data set found this trend that could only be applied to like 5% of the country. No, that's like 7% of everyone in low income families. That's a huge number of people. And then you get to the college system and, college applications. We're doing that right now.
Yeah.
You have to have a certain GPA. You have to have been in school for however many hours. You have to be able to afford to do clubs. And you have to be able to afford to bring lunch, because if you don't bring lunch, if you don't buy lunch, then you're not going to focus in class.
Mm-hmm.
You have to afford to buy your school supplies. What if you can't afford to buy a notebook or a pencil? What if your parents can't give that to you? School itself is, once again, stacked against the deck.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be able to afford to take your ACT and your SAT. You have to be able to afford to take AP classes. You have to be able to afford to pay the application fees for college and textbook fees, and you have to be able to afford to go to college, which, if you can't, you take out hundreds of $1,000s in student loans and then end up paying over $1 million and not even making a dent in your loan because of the high interest rates.
Mm-hmm.
The entire thing, the whole thing from start to finish, is stacked against people who don't have any money and therefore cannot use education as
social mobility.
Yes.
For sure. Definitely in terms of college admissions, it is worth noting that, fee waivers exist. Like, for example, I have free lunch, so I get fee waivers, but even then there's a bit of disparity. Some kids with money can take the SAT or the ACT 5 or 6 times until they get the score that they want.
Yeah.
I had 2 shots at the SAT. I studied really hard, and even with the SAT, I remember I was studying so hard. I thought I got my math up, and the curve that, how they curve the SAT, the curve, it wasn't good that time. So then I'm like, okay, it's time to take the ACT, but the fact is you only get 2 tries at each. And that's less than people who are able to shell out the money and take it 6 times. Or I think it's not even, sometimes it's a matter of paying for like the extra things. Like, you can pay for a college admissions counselor to craft like the perfect application for you, or pay to have someone review your essays, or even things like extracurriculars. Like, I'm trying to think of an example. I do Model UN, and I couldn't afford to go to Gatormont, which was this trip. Well, a lot of people in the club couldn't shell out that money like right off the bat. So I had to fundraise like $500 just so we could all like get on a bus and go on this competition, where I knew we were competing against schools who did it with no problem, and that they had like Model UN teams who were known for being good, and that they were like those kind of private schools where they took MUN as a class and they practice constantly, and it's just like, there's just a lot of built-in disadvantages in that way.
Yeah.
Another thing that happens is children from low-income families often have slower rates of development, and there have been a lot of studies that say it's because maybe their parents have to spend more time working, or maybe they don't have access to books to read, like children's books, because that's a huge part of your childhood development. And I've heard people argue, just go to the library. Libraries are free. Why can't they just go to the library?
You can't drive to the library if you're a child and your parents aren't working.
Right.
It's a real issue.
Resident. So let's say if you're an undocumented immigrant, maybe you don't have the necessary government ID to go something as simple as go to the library and use their Wi-Fi. And, even then it gets to the point by when you're in high school, doing all your work at the library it's too much. It's a lot. I'm sure all of us has experienced being up really late doing way more work than should be assigned to us.
Yeah.
And driving is a privilege. What if you're one of those parents who has to decide between eating and driving, and you can't just drive your children to the library? Like, people who are privileged do not recognize their own privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And so they think, oh, just drive to the library because they can afford to get gas and eat.
Mm-hmm.
They don't think about the people who have to make that choice every day and who have to decide, hey, I can't do this. And it's just like the disparity is so huge, and so many people just choose to ignore it because it makes them uncomfortable.
Right. And then when we were talking about college admissions, I mean, we go to the same school, and we have one counselor for how many kids?
600.
600 kids. She doesn't have time to talk to any of us. So, again, that's going back on how strongly I feel about maybe budgeting more money towards education. You know, just a thought. Put it towards our future, right?
Just maybe.
Yeah.
On the off chance you want to, forward your country.
We are discussing Hammurabi and social stratification and everything. We do have to focus on color-coded justice and the most prevalent issue right now, Black Lives Matter.
Right. So, Black Lives Matter is currently one of the most iconic movements for bringing awareness to the failures of the U.S. criminal justice system. As mentioned previously, African Americans are one of the most disadvantaged groups in terms of criminal justice.
African American men are incarcerated at a rate of 2,272 per 100,000 as compared to 392 over 100,000 for white men. So this makes them nearly 6 times more likely to face incarceration at some point in their lives, which is huge. That is a terrible statistic.
Right.
It's really like the odds are stacked against you.
The racial disparities in socioeconomic standing, as African Americans tend to make up a substantial portion of low-income communities, combined with the fact that prosecutors are more likely to charge Black defendants under state habitual offender laws than similarly situated white defendants, effectively stack the deck against minority races in the eyes of the law.
Yeah, I wanted to bring this up real quick. Having my experience with the criminal justice system, I'm just going to speak about my father in general. The situation he was born into was one just exactly like you described. One where his mother was a single mother, he didn't know his father, and he was at a low socioeconomic status. And he unfortunately turned to criminal actions to get by. And he didn't he didn't have another option essentially, and he wasn't given an opportunity to learn from that. And unfortunately, I really believe that if he were white, that he would have had that opportunity. Someone would have said, oh, you're a bright kid, you have potential.
Yeah.
But they saw him as a criminal from the moment he was born, and it's one of the most saddening things to me.
Not only do African Americans often receive unequal treatment by authority in the event they do commit a crime, but they rarely get justice when a crime is committed against them by law enforcement. So the police serve on the front line of the justice system, so they are the first level of the justice system. And it's supposed to be impartial. But it's pretty obvious that it's not impartial in the slightest. More often than not, African Americans generally experience harsher policing practices than white Americans, as officers usually use racially based discretion, sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional. So take the fatal shooting of Michael Brown in 2014. He was an 18-year-old who was stopped for jaywalking, a minor offense, literally nothing, yet he still ended up dead, shot in self-defense by the officer Darren Wilson, despite the fact that Brown was unarmed and 18 years old and didn't do anything. Another example can be seen in the fatal shooting of Eric Garner in New York City in 2014. Garner was arrested for selling untaxed cigarettes and was placed into an unauthorized chokehold by author Daniel Pantaleo, and he suffocated him to death, and Garner was also unarmed. Imagine. So both of these things, jaywalking, literally nothing, selling untaxed cigarettes, just a way for him to get by. He was probably from a disadvantaged community.
Yeah.
And to have the first level of law enforcement take away your right to a trial, your right to a jury, your right to a fair and impartial, for literally nothing. For nothing. These officers who are supposed to be upholders of the law robbed these people of their human rights as U.S. citizens, as people.
Yeah.
And I can't even.
It's the worst form of an abuse of power, and it's actually taking away. It's like going back in history, taking away civil liberties from these people of color, just because they're people of color.
Right.
It's very difficult to discuss like each person and how, especially when I hear that, I consider that was a person who didn't know that they were going to end up dead for a minor mistake, or just not even something that you would consider that you would get charged for. I really think that it's just sad, essentially, that the American justice system and America in general has failed these individuals by not providing them with the proper tools of justice, not holding officers accountable, not training officers properly, not investigating officers properly. It's horrifying.
Definitely building on to what Julia said, I think that each of these names represents a person, and I think in a way, when you have their names being used in this context to discuss like police brutality and like race-driven police brutality, I think not only they had like such a life aside from that, and then that becomes their memory, and not only that, but they just become part of like this long list. I'm sure you guys have seen people make it, I disagree with people who for their own like personal benefit turn it into shirts or into like those big lists when if they're not like donating the profits. That's such another sad topic, but that's something I strongly disagree with. But I just think they just become a part of this long list, and you repeat their name so many times that it's like it almost becomes this idea like, yeah, it's a tragedy, and then nothing happens. You see that very often, that it's like, oh, this was just one bad instance, but the instance happens time and time again, and it's not so much a few bad apples so much as it's indicative of like a systematic problem within at first glance the police force, but then when you zoom back, the entire criminal justice system as a whole.
I'm gonna bring up that a lot of the counter arguments to statistics like these and to people like these is that that white people are killed as well, and that's an issue. Like, that's a problem. Yeah. Like, why are you not upset about that? It's a problem. And one thing I also want to bring up is that people with mental disabilities are also extremely mistreated by police officers. I think it was just, a week or two ago where a boy who was mentally disabled was killed by police, I think.
No, I know which case you're talking about. He was 13. He was seriously injured. His mom called the police. She wasn't looking for armed police officers. She was looking for some sort of crisis team because her son had a mental break. Right. And then it ended up being a group of armed officers that said that they were threatened by this 13-year-old kid who had mental like disabilities, and he's alive to my understanding. He's in the hospital.
I think he was just temporarily stunned, but he was injured.
Yeah.
I
thought he was shot. I don't know if we're talking about the same person.
I don't remember the exact details of the case, but that happens way, way, way too often, where police officers will escalate the situation beyond, way beyond what it needs to be.
And then we have of course, the iconic killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. We were just talking about that. And George Floyd, he was arrested because he was buying cigarettes using a counterfeit $20 bill, which, to be honest, I probably wouldn't have known if someone slipped me a $20 bill and I was going to use it.
Like, why would you even check? Yeah. That's what I want to know. Why was it checked? Because you have to check counterfeit bills.
Yeah, I've had my bills like checked by just I don't even know when I'm buying a soda. It's just polarized. Like it's very strange to experience, and you wonder, is it just me? Am I just overreacting, or is there some sort of judgment, a preconceived notion about me that's in play?
I have never had that happen to me.
You've
never even had a glimpse of that. Never in my life.
I sell Girl Scout cookies because I'm a Girl Scout, and for us, I don't know why this was such a problem where we were, but we were getting like a lot of counterfeit money. So we had to buy. We check everyone's bills. We have these little pens that you buy online. We check people's bills. It started because we thought it was the coolest day ever. This is such a random thing. This guy gave us like an $100 tip, and it looked real. And then Mr. Jana, who's our troop leader, was like, maybe that's not true, and she checked it was fake. And then after that, it happened like enough times that we were like, now we have to check everything. But there's a difference between that when you're checking every bill you get and them going after people because they can perceive them to be like, oh, they probably aren't paying with real money.
I think an argument people use a lot of the time when they're talking about some issue of police brutality, they're like, well, don't do anything, don't commit crime, and you won't have to worry about the police. But as you said, you brought up Breonna Taylor. She was sleeping.
Yeah.
And it was her ex-boyfriend that was suspected of selling drugs from her house. Just because she had an affiliation with someone in her past led to her death. And I cannot believe that still goes on in America today. It's just I don't even have words for it. It's horrifying. And to think that people see that as, oh, well, it's just how the system works. No, we can always change it. That's what America was founded on, is changing it. You can't just accept it the way something is going. You can't accept somebody's death. That was a person. You have to learn from it. Give them justice.
Right.
I really, really hate it when people say, oh, that's just how it works, or, oh, there's always going to be people like that. Like, just because you cannot eliminate it entirely does not mean you stop trying.
Right.
It does not give up and let it happen and let it get worse. Mm-hmm. You have to be proactive in your prevention. Otherwise, what's even the point of doing anything? Because there's always going to be someone doing the opposite. So why even have laws if there's always going to be someone who breaks them?
Right. And when we're talking about change, it's also important to note that minorities have increased exponentially in America. Mm-hmm. We're not exactly the majority yet, but we're getting very close. So, and it bothers me so much that other minorities don't stand up for Black Lives Matter, especially when it affects all of us, especially us. And I get a lot of people that I'm Asian, so when I get a lot of people in my family that tell me, oh, that they don't understand. A lot of immigrants, they don't understand why Black Lives Matter is so big. Why is everyone so upset? And really just educating people on these issues is so important because from my understanding, most Asian Americans, they don't fight back when these things happen to them. So we're titled the model minority, but that's only because we're so afraid. We don't want to fight back. And I have an uncle that's actually very progressive, and what he told me was that it's actually awesome that Black people are fighting back against the system because they have more courage than Asian people have ever had to go against that, which I
Yeah.
thought was just like a really beautiful sentiment. And I think that's how all minorities should feel about Black Lives Matter and standing up for that change.
I just wanted to say it demonstrates the importance of allyship, especially within like minority movements, LGBT movements, even just all minorities. The importance of allyship and allyship. Oh my goodness, in making change and progress.
I was gonna sort of say like a combination of both things. My mom is Asian and my dad is white, and I've seen like the reaction from the Asian community generally be like you were talking about. There's this idea of like Asians as the quote unquote model minority myth, and that a lot of it has to do with, I've read about it a lot. A lot of it has to do with like proximity to whiteness, and not only that, but being afraid to rock the boat. Or a lot of people view it as like they're grateful to be in this country and they feel like it's unpatriotic or it's un-American to criticize your country. But the most patriotic thing you can do is to say that your country should change and to say like how you think it should be better. And also, what was I gonna say? In regards to something like allyship, something that really bothered me in June is that I'm a member of the LGBT community, and I saw some people that I know who were completely silent on Black Lives Matter, and then they put up like a cute little thing for Pride, like a cute little Instagram poster or whatever. Obviously, there were no Prides in real life because COVID, it was canceled, but that really bothered me, and I was able to articulate it as the reason that LGBT people have the rights that we have today. That fight was a fight. That fight was fought primarily by Black trans women, and there's a lot. It's a stereotype, but there is a stereotype that especially like white gays, they just tend to brush a lot of that under the rug and are very like narrow-minded in their view of the world. And especially in my opinion, Pride should be what it was, which is a protest for our rights and like the things that we still have to fight for, rather than like, sure, it is a celebration to some extent, but it shouldn't be like this big party. And I think I thought about that a lot this year, about how we should really be like uplifting like Black voices, especially within the LGBT community, because we have a lot of like inner issues with that.
I am actually the only white person on our team, which I am extremely happy about. I really represents demographics of the world, and not just in America. And like I feel extremely comfortable knowing that our team is a representation of this country rather than white privilege.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was just one thing I wanted to bring up regarding, especially like prosecuting police for their actions. I don't know if you've heard of the Police Bill of Rights. Have you?
I think I have. I think I covered that in criminal justice class.
Yeah, I I learned about it at a protest, and I researched a little bit more. It's essentially one of the many loopholes that officers can get through just with no or limited consequences for their actions, especially when it comes to brutality or the killing of innocent people. And I think that when we're talking about these issues like we are now, the next step in that is often missed. So you don't hear about the laws that we should target and get rid of and the progressive actions that we need to take. There's more of an emotional appeal that yes, we should do something, but how do we do it? And I think informing people on those laws and those loopholes and a new system that could work better, just general research is very important in this fight. We definitely need to be educated, especially like just what you said about the value of education needs to be centered around that. We need to have some education.
I think that's the best. Yeah, I think that's the best part about being in Gen Z, because I think we as a generation understand the value of information and how to make change based on spreading that information. And when we look at history, civil rights has really been just like it's been coming in phases and shifts in the timeline. This is our moment, and this is what we're doing right now to fight it. And there's always going to be another step, so we just have to keep pushing.
Yeah.
Also, building onto laws, there was this law, I don't know if it's exactly a law, but there's this thing called qualified immunity that basically it is incredibly hard to prosecute cops on the basis of their bad behavior unless a legal precedent has been established on a case that was really similar. Like, they will knock off the case if it's not similar to like very small details, and that's one of the ways that it's very difficult to like prosecute to prosecute officers who are committing some kind of wrongdoing, especially with the power of like police unions.
So the Black Lives Matter movement is not only to bring attention to societal flaws, but to also bring attention to the need for reform in the justice system. Of course, just as a disclaimer, not all law enforcement officers are racially biased or corrupt, but there are gaps in the system that allow problematic officers to slip through, and it gives them the authority to exercise their practices against people. So, this comes with the main idea of the Black Lives Matter movement of police reform, in that defunding the police and funding specified groups to handle cases that do not require physical violent force is extremely important. Just like for the case with the 13-year-old boy we were talking about earlier, his mother called hoping to get someone who could handle his case specifically, and instead was met with armed police officers, which is dangerous for everyone in that situation.
Right.
Some ideas for reform implementation are early warning systems to identify problematic officers, like the ones that have had multiple infractions, like 12 infractions for one police officer, and ridiculous. Extensive police training, because right now in some regions police are only required to do 6 months of training.
Yeah, which is not enough.
But, body cameras on at all times, civilian review boards to discipline officers, basically the repeal of officer protecting codes like the Officer Bill of Rights and qualified immunity. And then the development of groups that would be able to handle specific cases rather than just one law enforcement for everything, which clearly does not work.
I think those policies that you listed are very important, of course. But as you said, this is the first step towards in the criminal justice system. After this, there's still issues with prosecuting, even if it doesn't involve a police officer. I just wanted to bring up Trayvon Martin and the unfortunate circumstances surrounding that, and how his killer has made a profit off of his death. And he was never put in jail for that. And that was due to a law that was instituted. I don't know if you've heard of the backstory behind this, but major corporations were joined together in an organization that lobbied for certain policies. One of those policies was the Stand Your Ground law, which allowed George Zimmerman to get away with that murder. And that's just another instance of an unfair law set up by a corporation to gain a profit off of the criminal justice system, to gain a profit off incarcerating people and not considering them human.
Yeah, for sure. What I was going to say, that in regards to the disclaimer, maybe a disclaimer for the disclaimer, that in my personal opinion, I've done a lot of research before I would say something this generalizing. Do I believe that all law enforcement officers are inherently evil and that they are all like the worst kind of people? No, I don't. But I think that in partaking in how police, like, how do you say, police stations, I guess, or like the system of policing, if currently partaking in it, I do believe in ACAB to some extent. I believe that the system needs major reform. Do I believe in the entire abolishment of the police? Not exactly, but I think they should receive significantly less funding, and that, like you guys said, a lot of that funding should go towards training social workers, because I think de-escalation is just really, really important, and I think police shouldn't have to respond to 90% of the things that they respond to. But in the long run, that this would be a good thing for policing within the United States, that they wouldn't have to handle the caseload that they currently do, and that they would be trained more, and that they would respond to things that warrant that kind of training. But yeah, that's just my opinion on it.
So, this is the end of the podcast. Make sure you check out the Forerunners next issue on mental health, or read their last issue on the influence of Black creators in pop culture.
Dear Hammurabi, you have gained infamy for creating the first code of law which detailed specific punishments for the crime committed, and set into motion social stratification and an unjust system. When we looked back at these codes and saw deep-rooted disparity in terms of justice, we wonder, what could you have possibly been thinking? Did you have any idea how the codes you developed would still be conceptually present in the laws we have today? Did you think when you created your code that you would still be famous 4,000 years in the future? Some people believe that your code should be the model for legal systems today, but we disagree. We see that there is better potential for how we can rehabilitate offenders and provide equal justice to all people, regardless of class, race, gender, or identity. We recognize the importance of seeing people as humans rather than property. And we wonder, how could you have missed that? We have a better hope for the future, and that as new legal systems are created or older ones improved, they will not be rooted in systematic racism and sexism. Gen Z sees the potential for change in the world today, and we are so sorry that people have suffered in the past and are still suffering today. Hopefully, we'll work this out. Sincerely, Gen Z. This has been Yvonne Liu and Emily Lohman. Join us next time as we explore ancient Egypt and the development of colorism. We want to say thank you to our amazing social media team, research and editing team for helping to put together this episode. Follow us on all platforms at Dear Dead People the Podcast for updates and news. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.